Welcome to Think Change. I'm Sara Pantuliano. 1 year into President Donald Trump's second term, it is becoming clear that the world affairs are entering a far more volatile phase. In just the opening weeks of 2026, the United States has taken a series of extraordinary steps. The removal of Venezuela's sitting president, renewed speculation about intervention in Iran amid mass protests, and revived assertions over Greenland that challenged long held assumptions about sovereignty. Taken together, these moves point to something larger than a single crisis. They suggest a return to unapologetic power politics, to a world in which force, leverage, and spheres of influence matter more than rules, institutions, or international law. Some have described this as a kind of Monroe Doctrine 2.0, a reassertion of dominance justified in the language of security and strategic necessity. In such a world, global stability can hinge on a single presidential statement or rather on a social media post, and that is capable of rattling alliances, markets, diplomatic norms pretty much overnight. But today's episode is not really about Washington. Instead, we want to focus on a different question. How are other actors, states, regions, markets, recalibrating in response to this new phase of US foreign policy? And particularly, what does this mean for security in the Indo-Pacific, for global trade, for investment, and for the room the smaller states have to maneuver? The US National Security Strategy that was released late last year noted that the Indo-Pacific region will be one of the next century's key economic and geopolitical battlegrounds, and I'm quoting from the strategy, and that alliances in the Indo-Pacific region are going to serve, again, I quote, the bedrock of security and prosperity. The Kingdom of Tonga is emerging as a key player in the fight for influence in the Pacific region. I'm truly delighted to be able to interview the new Prime Minister of Tonga, His Excellency Lord Fatafehi Fakafānua. Welcome so much, Lord Fakafānua. Your Excellency, Pacific leaders often talk about a blue Pacific vision or treating the Pacific as one shared ocean continent with common interests and being friends to all and enemies to none. In an era of growing great power rivalry and the weakening of global rules, what does strategic autonomy actually mean for Tonga in practice?
Thank you, Sara. That's really a pivotal question during our time. As you mentioned before, the global order is changing, and the future is really uncertain for a small island developing state like the Kingdom of Tonga. If I take it back to our roots, we're a big ocean state, and we're a sovereign country. We're a kingdom. Secured through cultural heritage and possession of our waters and our islands over the last millennia. And we've never been colonized by a foreign power. We were secured by recognition by the great powers at a time where the Pacific region was really contested by colonial powers. And so Tonga has enjoyed the modern time of rules-based international order that was backed by the United States hegemony. And so what we're experiencing now is really an uncertainty in terms of where the United States and where the West is positioned in terms of that rules-based international order. As a small island, you understand that our foreign policy is friend to all and enemy to no one, and we are trying to maintain that in terms of where the great rivalries are happening. We have to be very, very delicate and nimble and agile, and be the small bollards that we are in the changing landscape. We don't want to upset anyone. We can't afford to. And so we have to ensure that we remain friends and accommodating to the great powers that be.
And what concrete mechanisms, for example, through the Pacific Islands Forum or the UN system or maybe unilateral groupings, do you see as really essential to ensuring that a small island state like Tonga can indeed remain friends with everyone, can still shape outcomes rather than just really absorbing the spillover effects of this, sort of great power rivalry or aims?
Where there's fracturing geopolitics internationally, we fall back on regionalism. And so groupings such as the Pacific Island Forum, where Pacific leaders have consensus on NK, is really important and pivotal because we recenter ourselves on our power base, and that is as a group. The Pacific is quite essential to the world. We're part of the Indo-Pacific region. Admittedly, we are quite a contested area as of late, but together we ensure that we are not lost in our individuality. So the Pacific is almost homogenous in our culture and our ideals and our values, and that probably helps us in terms of our engagement with both the East and the West.
Excellent. Lord Fakafānua, a substantial share of Tonga's external debt is owed to China. Tonga is also deepening partnerships with Australia, with New Zealand, with the United States, and with Japan. How do you ensure that debt obligations don't narrow Tonga's room for strategic decision-making? And what steps you think are available to ensure that the fiscal and foreign policy autonomy of Tonga is there as you seek to invest in climate resilience, in ports, in fisheries?
So in terms of Tonga's foreign debt, a large portion, a substantial portion of that is to the Exim Bank in China. And to be fair, we needed funding for reconstruction after the burning of Nuku'alofa, our capital, and China stepped in at a time where we needed strong fiscal measures to reconstruct our capital. And so the debt is something that Tonga is committed to and is paying, even though it is a large portion of our budget. We look forward to paying down that debt over the next few years, due to be completed around 2030. And in terms of its impact on our foreign policy, we haven't experienced any form of China leaning on us because of the debt. We signed into a debt agreement and we agreed to pay it off, and that's exactly what we're doing. In terms of our engagement with the West, we look forward to future collaboration and economic engagement in terms of unplugging the economic constraints in our small economy with key partners and allies such as the United States. The largest donor partner in terms of monetary budget support is from Australia, which is part of the key allies, the Five Eyes, closely followed by New Zealand, Japan, obviously China through their bilateral aids and projects. We are engaging with new donors and bilateral assistance with people like in India. We're looking at exploring closer relations with Indonesia. And obviously Tonga holds soft power in the Pacific as the last remaining monarchy. Royal family holds close ties with the imperial family in Japan, in Thailand, and obviously with the United Kingdom and across other royal families in Europe. And so that puts us in a unique position in the Pacific, that we have a royal family that engages on that level of high level engagement with other royal families.
Thank you so much, Lord Fakafānua, for being with us. I'm now joined by two other guests that will discuss what we've just heard from the Prime Minister. I'm joined by Manish Singh, Chief Investment Officer at Crossbridge Capital, and our very own Rebecca Nadin, Director of Global Risk and Resilience at ODI Global, as well as of the Center for Geopolitics of Global Change. Manish, you sit at the intersection of geopolitics, debt, and market behavior. Your insights can really help us unpack for our listeners how the hard power shocks of today, from military interventions to sanctions to climate risks, are transmitted through financial systems, and really how they shape borrowing costs, capital flows, and growth prospects, particularly for low and middle income economies. Looking at the rising geopolitical tensions, the trade disputes, the very high global debt, do you feel we're living through a temporary period of turbulence, or has the global economy entered a new and more permanently unstable era?
Thank you, Sara, for having me on the podcast. Thank you very much. To answer your question, very straightforward. If you look at historical times, I would say this to me feels like you have the dislocations of 1930s and 1970s combined together. And the reason I say that, because in 1930s, clearly there was less control. The world was less controlled, and you had issues of debt, and the world order was shifting, the rules were changing. And I say 1970s also because this has become about energy security. And energy was a big problem in 1970s when oil prices went up and everything that was happening then. So to me, this seems more like a combination of 1930s and 1970s that we are being presented. And I would say that this is not a temporary dislocation. This is a structural change, in my opinion. It has some semblance of cyclical, but a lot of thing is structural because the international bodies, international agreements are getting challenged. And in this case, by US, which set some of these international bodies, as you know. So I think that becomes a very interesting topic to think about. And also remember, economic stability is an institutional achievement. It is not a default condition that capitalism delivers to anyone. If you look at what happened in the time of Bretton Woods, and how that was an agreement between parties, how to maintain stability, exchange rate, debt, and what it should be. And that, to me, is failing now because there is more disagreement. It's also because the competition to US, China in this case, or Russia militarily, they do feel that they haven't had the say that they should have. And China particularly, because China is a big economic and military power, unlike Russia, which is just purely a military power. China is economic plus military power, and they have to have a say. So to me, this is definitely structural. We cannot call it cyclical or temporary dislocation. And we are going to need new agreements. And those new agreements, we don't know. I mean, what that is going to be like. Is it going to be based on might? It is going to be based on trade or a combination of that. We are going to find out in due course. And to your point about financing needs, I have a sneaky feeling that, you might see some countries adopting the dollar, the ones who have not adopted the dollar so far, just to protect themselves away from the challenges that they are going to face. And because we are talking about Asia Pacific and emerging market, I mean, you do see that dollar plays a hugely important role in trade between these countries. And so you have strong emerging market nations like India, Indonesia, and others who probably will tide away this crisis much better. And then you have the ones, like Argentina, Sri Lanka, and others who have much higher debt capacity, and they will really feel the challenge. So you will see a new form of agreement come through, but it will have to be negotiated.
Thanks, Manish. You rightly, put China at the center of a lot of what is going to happen in the Indo-Pacific. Rebecca, you have worked in China for more than 15 years, know the context and the politics really well. How do you think this breakdown in international legal order will influence China's external strategy? I mean, we've talked about the economy, but what does this mean for flashpoints such as Taiwan and Iran?
Yeah. So I think from China's perspective, what it's doing is it's absolutely reinforcing for China a long-held belief going actually right back to the 19th century that the international legal system is used against China, is used against other countries as needed by the great powers. So this is reinforcing this long-held belief. It's basically, as well for China, they see Venezuela, Panama, Greenland, and all of these statements by Donald Trump, by the Americans, actually as part of a coherent doctrine that the US has, which the US has actually has had for a long time, if we go back to the Monroe Doctrine, which was actually to hold the European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. But now this is being applied to China. And from Beijing's perspective, this is about squeezing China out of those strategic spaces, that those hemispheres by hemisphere, ocean by ocean. So for China, in terms of the international legal order, I mean, for a long time, China has sought itself to reform that. It's felt that it was unfair. And actually, ironically, of course, those are some of the arguments that Donald Trump has, that this has been an unjust system to the Americans, that it's been unfair, it's so on. And actually, Beijing has made those similar points, and both in different ways have sought to reform that international system. So China, by seeking more influence since it joined the UN, for example, in 1971, it went from being largely seeing participation as part of the opening up of China. So very much participation, joining the international architecture, joining the international rules-based order, to now actually seeking to be a reformer. So going from an acceptor of that to now seeking to reform. And we saw at the 20th National Party Congress, where Xi Jinping made a strong push to increase China's international law capabilities across all domains. And where China is focused at the moment is particularly in domains such as outer space, deep ocean, the Arctic, etc. So trying to influence and create norms and standards in those areas, such as monitoring outer space communications in terms of extractives, etc. Those things that are absolutely critical for the Chinese economy.
Manish, when financial markets react to wars, sanctions, or climate shocks, the effects that often hit poor countries and emerging economies hardest are because of higher borrowing costs, currency swings, capital flight. How do you expect the volatile global environment that we see today to shape the economic prospects of these countries over the next decade?
Yeah, a very good question. I mean, you're absolutely right that when it comes to especially emerging market or developing economy, weaker currencies, higher borrowing costs, capital flight is a phenomenon. In my opinion, the 20s, if we call this 2020s, is going to shape the 30s, by which I mean that volatility is going to continue. We are moving towards a world, in my opinion, not of broad convergence, but a greater divergence. I do think that the US foreign policy is very much centered around, not around efficiency, which was the case before, because the companies and sovereigns were trying to get the most efficient capital, or trying to ensure that they don't do all the manufacturing locally and give it away to emerging market or developing market, and really just care about efficiency, which means that the business decisions now, at least in the Western world, on sovereign side mostly, but less on the private side, is not being shaped by return on invested capital. It is being shaped by national security issues. And these have implications for the local markets and governments, because the partnership will be chosen not for economic reason alone, but for political reason. So any economy that relies on foreign debt, that has, let's say, one or two export items, not a diversified basket of exports, they are inherently at a risk, where they may be forced to choose sides, which is not necessarily good for them, but is good for the trading partner. So in my opinion, a lot of these things are going to show up. You are seeing the way Argentina has responded to things that the US has said. What's happened in Venezuela, we have discussed that in the past. I think these things become very important. So what can a developing market or emerging economies do? I mean, they really have to have a very, very good monetary policy, because if you cannot control and have very independent monetary policy, then you are at mercy of what's going to happen on the global sector. If you cannot strike good regional balances and cannot play one power against the other, which is where the politics comes into play, and that depends on the size of the economy, then you are again at the risk. And despite doing all these things, they might still be at a risk based on what the major powers are going to work on. So I'm sorry to say, but they are at the receiving end, and I'm likely they are going to be at the receiving end for a few years, because while I do predict that there will be volatility, it doesn't mean that things are going to fall apart. Things have to be negotiated. Just like I said, post World War II, we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which lasted for 20 years. And then we had 1970s and the global expansion from 89 to at least 2008, which was a peace-driven growth environment. It was because the big powers were dominating. So I would say that all domestic economies can do is basically run a reasonable monetary policy, stable monetary policy, try to diversify away from one or two items of exports to more, strike more regional balances. And even then it may not be enough, but that's the future that we are heading into.
I think you're absolutely right. And, I think probably the regional alliances and some of these balances will be key, because we just don't know how much you can trust the big power. I mean, when they turn on their own allies, it's very difficult to predict who is going to be your friend in this context. And on that, Rebecca, I mean, there is a lot of speculation that China might point to the use of force by the US in Venezuela as a precedent to justify tougher actions against Taiwan. How plausible is that argument, do you think?
I think there's sort of two parts to this. One part is that actually the Venezuela action is absolutely a useful argument, but I would say it's a kind of a poor template, and that's for several reasons. I mean, absolutely, the US action in Venezuela will and is being used by the Chinese to articulate as evidence of double standards. There's absolutely no two ways about that. And also, when looking at what's being said in China, so looking at what's actually coming out of the Chinese media, the Chinese academics and Chinese government statements, I mean, there's a clear argument there that this sort of coercive regime change is becoming normalized, and this could make a Taiwan contingent more normalized. But certainly from Beijing's perspective, and even if we look at history ourselves, coercive regime change is not a new concept, and America has done that several times, as of other powers. If you look at Nicaragua, if you look at Grenada, etc., there's lots of examples. But I think what is important, if we're trying to make this comparison between Venezuela and what may or may not happen in Taiwan, what we need to think about is Taiwan is not Venezuela. So I think one important point is Taiwan is strongly military defended in a way that Venezuela isn't. Also, it is part of a web of alliances, security guarantees, with the US being one of those, of course. But and then the other point is that it is absolutely key in terms of regional trade and semiconductors and all of those sort of things. So I think, clearly international law is not going to be a constraint, but China itself would not have been constrained by international law. And there's many examples, particularly in South China Sea, where China does not accept decisions by the ICJ, etc. But what I think it does show for China, and this is what is important, is that it strengthens the case from Beijing's perspective, probably more around what we call grey zone coercion. So this is kind of more military drills, those military drills. I mean, China could cut off the Taiwan Strait without firing a bullet by simply carrying out extensive and long Coast Guard drills, military drills, etc., through economic pressure, through information ops, through psyops, all of these different things that Beijing can do. But it definitely, I think, reinforces for Beijing the importance of strengthening those areas. And I think what was a big shock not just Venezuela, not so much the shock, but I think the biggest shock for Beijing at the minute was Trump's statements around Greenland, because the shock was not that the US is doing this, but the shock that it's doing it to its allies.
Well, I have just one last question for both of you. We saw a clear but pretty muted criticism of the US action in Venezuela. Can we expect this acquiescence to continue, especially in light of Greenland and other threats?
So, Sarah, if I can go first, I think that with Venezuela, the response was muted because despite the size of Venezuelan economy, it is not seen as one of these global players, that people are interested in. I think with Iran, it's going to be different because there are lots of vested interests, neighbors, they share the border politics. So I don't think it'll be as muted. And I think China and Russia probably will have a much robust response by way of vocal or anything else that you're going to see. So I don't think it'll be as muted as Venezuela. And therefore, I said at the onset, today looks more like the 1970s in its shock, but 1930s in its political context. Because I think that the unity that we have seen, rule-based thing, and when you have high debt, social strain, weaker global coordination, which clearly is becoming weaker by the day, given the post from President Trump yesterday, there's a lot at stake. So stability isn't the absence of shocks, it's the presence of institutions that absorb them. And those institutions are really getting challenged, and those institutions have to be redefined and reset. So I keep coming back to the same fact that it's structural. How big a structural, we'll find out because we are in midst of it, so we can't say. But I'm still very hopeful that, peace can be maintained, institutions can be built. But negotiations are going to be much harder. You will not have the Chinese and Russians sitting back and letting US or Europe do what it has done in the past and agree to rules. And those rules have to be negotiated and rediscussed.
Great. Rebecca.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the Iran point is an important one. I mean, China clearly was not happy about the Venezuela action. They've lent Venezuela almost 67 billion. I think the Venezuelans still owe them about 10 billion USD, and that was being repaid in part in oil, etc. But with Venezuela, I think, or with Iran, sorry, it's quite different. I mean, Iran is much closer geographically to China. It's much more important in terms of the energy security. Iran provides a lot of oil to China. Also, the Middle East writ large is an important strategic area for China. This goes back to the Mao era of the Mao's intermediate theory, where you have these nations that are close and can potentially destabilize. So, but I think what it is doing for China is really reinforcing this long-held belief that the rules-based international order is selectively applied. And I think that for Beijing, the absolute takeaway is international law is not going to protect your investments, your security interests when they collide with US doctrine. And what we are absolutely going to see from China is more hedging, more diversification, and more of a reason actually for Beijing to harden the theaters where China can push back on the US.
And I asked the same question to the Prime Minister before. Let's hear what he had to say.
Look, we're in no position to comment on any of the Trump administration's future actions. However, we take note of the strong military action that happened in South America. It is something that is of concern to us because law and order impacts our shores. To give you an idea, after the volcanic eruption in 2022, just out of COVID, we suffered a massive tsunami that obviously devastated some of our islands, and we had to migrate people. About 2 or 3 months after that, Russia decided to invade Ukraine. And both the invasion of Ukraine and restrictions in OPEC supply saw double-digit inflation on our shores. Now, the cost of living is something that most of the islands are very concerned with, but that means that we're not isolated from these impacts and geopolitical movements across the other side of the world. So we're looking to the West and to the United States to provide stability, to ensure that the rules-based international order is there to protect the smaller players, such as small island developing states. But having said that, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the White House issued a statement late last year restricting visa entry for certain countries. And Tonga was one of the countries where, from the 1st of January, our citizens can no longer apply for a visitor's permit into the United States and also for student visas. And given that we have a large diaspora and a long connection with the United States, our people are very concerned about the future of our relationship. And it's something that we're working very closely to resolve with the State Department.
Well, today's conversation reminds us that in a world returning to raw power politics, the stakes are not abstract. For small island states like Tonga, geopolitical shocks are not distant headlines. They translate into rising prices, into shrinking policy space, and into the real risks to sovereignty and security. As global rules fray and alliances shift, I think the question is no longer whether the international order is changing, but whether it can still protect those with the least power and the most to lose. Thank you so much to Prime Minister Fakafānua, to Manish and Rebecca for helping us unpack what this moment means beyond Washington, specifically for the Indo-Pacific, for global markets, and for the future of multilateralism itself. You've been listening to Think Change. If you found this conversation valuable, please share it, subscribe, and join us next time as we continue to explore how the world is being reshaped and what will it take to build more stable and equitable global systems.